She made an example of him. But the human smile changed everything. The alien queen never expected him to smile back. Queen Asher stood on the highest balcony of her obsidian palace, her silver armor catching the light of twin suns that bathed, her empire in ethereal radiance. Below, the execution square stretched endlessly, filled with thousands of her subjects who had gathered to witness justice. But this was no ordinary execution. This was meant to be a message, a warning to any who dared challenge her rule. At the center of the platform, bound to the ancient crucifix of judgment, was Ryan, the last surviving member of the human diplomatic envoy that had arrived seeking peace just days before. His face bore the marks of interrogation, his chest stained with dried blood, but his eyes held something that made Asher's breath catch in her throat. He was looking directly at her, and against all reason, all logic, he was smiling. The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. In 2 centuries of rule, Asher had never encountered such defiance, such inexplicable peace in the face of certain death. She had broken kings and conquered worlds, had seen the strongest warriors weep before her judgment. Yet this human, this fragile, beaten man, gazed at her with something that felt dangerously close to understanding. "You mock this court," she called down to him, her voice carrying across the silent square like ice cracking under pressure. Her words were meant to condemn, to justify what was about to happen. Ryan's smile only deepened, and when he spoke, his voice was clear despite his wounds. "No, Your Majesty, I just see the truth now." The crowd gasped. Truth was a forbidden word in Asher's presence. Only obedience was permitted. Only silence. Yet something in his tone, in the way he held her gaze without flinching, sent an unfamiliar tremor through her chest. This was not the fear she was accustomed to inspiring. This was something else entirely. She had interrogated him for days after, sparing him from the massacre of his companions. Not out of mercy, Asher knew nothing of mercy, but out of a curiosity that gnawed at her like hunger. Why did humans cling to concepts like love and peace when such things offered no strategic advantage? She had offered him everything: comfort, power, even a place at her side if he would renounce his people's ideals. He had refused it all. When offers failed, she had turned to pain. She watched him bleed, listened to him scream, waited for the moment when his spirit would finally break as all others had. But each time she thought victory was hers, that insufferable smile would return, lighting his face like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. Now, as she stood above him in this moment, a final judgment, Asher felt something shift within the carefully constructed walls of her heart. 200 years of absolute rule had taught her that power meant the absence of weakness, that strength required the death of compassion. Yet this human smile spoke of a different kind of strength, one that seemed to grow stronger the more it was tested. The queen's silver armor suddenly felt heavy on her shoulders. For the first time in centuries, she found herself questioning not the human sanity, but her own certainty. Asher descended from her balcony, her flowing robes trailing behind her like storm clouds gathering before a tempest. The crowd parted, before her as it always did, her subjects bowing their heads in submission, their scaled skin shimmering with nervous tension. But today felt different. Today, their queen moved with a purpose that none could fully understand, least of all herself. Her footsteps echoed against the marble steps as she approached the execution platform. Each step brought her closer to the human who had somehow managed to disturb the perfect order of her world with nothing more than an inexplicable smile. Guards flanked her path, their weapons gleaming, yet she noticed how their eyes kept darting between her and the prisoner, sensing the strange tension that crackled in the air like electricity before lightning strikes. "I have crushed empires, with less effort than it took to hold you down," she said as she reached the base of the platform, her voice carrying the weight of 2 centuries of absolute authority. It was meant to be a statement of fact, a reminder of the natural order of things. Ryan looked down at her, his eyes tired but somehow still bright with that maddening inner light. "You never held me down," he replied softly, and then added words that sent a chill through her very soul. You just never looked up. Something flickered across her face, an expression so brief that only he caught it, but the crowd saw enough. They saw their invincible queen falter, saw uncertainty cross features that had never shown anything but cold certainty. In that instant, Ryan understood what he had suspected all along. Beneath all that armor, all that power, Queen Asher was afraid. Not afraid of him. He was, after all, just a dying human bound to wood and metal. She was afraid of what he represented, of the questions his very existence posed to the foundation upon which she had built her empire. She was afraid of the possibility that there might be another way to live, another way to rule, another way to be strong. Why do you still smile? She asked, stepping closer to the platform, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. You are dying in front of millions. You are alone. You have lost everything. Ryan shook his head slowly, that gentle smile never wavering. No, I haven't lost everything. Asher tilted her head, studying him with the intensity of a predator trying to understand prey that refused to behave as expected. What then have you gained? Your attention, he said simply, and maybe their hearts. He looked out over the crowd, and Asher followed his gaze. What she saw made her chest tighten with something she couldn't name. Some of her subjects wouldn't meet her eyes. Others looked uncertain, conflicted. A few seemed moved by something they couldn't articulate. The perfect unity of fear and obedience that had defined her reign was cracking, hairline fractures spreading through the foundation of her power. But it wasn't fear that gripped her now. It was something far more dangerous. It was the beginning of understanding, the first faint stirring of a heart she had thought buried beneath centuries of necessary cruelty. You think your death will change them? She asked, her voice sharp with something that might have been panic. You think a single human chained and bleeding could become a symbol? Ryan nodded, and in that simple gesture was a faith so pure it made her armor feel like paper. Yes. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and promise. And for the first time in her long reign, Queen Asher began to wonder if the strongest thing in the universe might not be power at all, but hope. Asher stepped forward, drawn by an impulse she didn't understand and couldn't resist. Her hand, pale and cold from centuries of wielding power without warmth, reached out to touch his chest. Through the dried blood and torn fabric, she could feel his heart beating. Steady, strong, unafraid, the rhythm seemed to echo in her own chest, awakening something that had been dormant for so long she had forgotten it existed. I could end you now, she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. One word, and the blades descend. But you won't, Ryan replied with quiet certainty. The simplicity of his faith in her better nature was like a blade cutting through the careful constructs of her hardened heart. Why? She asked. And for the first time in 2 centuries, a queen was asking a question she genuinely didn't know the answer to. Because something inside you doesn't want to, he said, his eyes searching her face with a gentleness that made her want to flee and stay in equal measure. You are not as empty as you pretend to be. Her hand jerked back as if burned. His words hit her with more force than any weapon ever had, not the brutal impact of steel and plasma, but the devastating precision of truth finding its mark in a soul that had thought itself beyond reach. The memory came unbidden, rising from depths she had sealed away centuries ago. She was young then, barely more than a child, standing in the ashes of her burned village. Her sister lay dying in her arms, the victim of raiders who had shown no mercy to the weak. In that moment of unbearable loss, Asher had made a vow that shaped every day that followed. She would never be weak again. She would become strong enough that no one could ever hurt her the way they had hurt her sister. That pain had forged her into a queen, into a weapon, into something that could rule through fear because love had proven too fragile to protect what mattered most. But this human, this impossible smiling human, was suggesting that her greatest strength might actually be her greatest weakness, that the armor she wore to protect her heart had become its prison. I should hate you, she said, her voice thick, with emotions she had thought herself incapable of feeling. I should erase your name and memory from every archive. But you won't, Ryan said again, and somehow he made it sound not like a challenge, but like a promise, like he saw something in her that she had given up on long ago. Because you remember me, he continued softly. Not the prisoner, not the human who defied your rule. You remember who you were before you became what you thought you had to be. The crowd had fallen so silent that even the guards looked uneasy. This was no longer an execution. It had become something none of them could define, a moment suspended between what was and what might be. The very air seemed to shimmer with possibility, heavy with the weight of a choice that could reshape an empire. Asher looked into his eyes and saw no fear, only a fire that burned with the same intensity as the love she had once known, the peace she had once believed in. For the first time in 2 centuries, the queen of the Zyron Empire allowed herself to remember what it felt like to hope. And somewhere in the depths of her carefully guarded heart, something that had been frozen for far too long began, at last, to thaw. Asher turned and walked away from the platform, each step echoing like thunder in the absolute silence of the square. Whispers followed her like shadows, 10,000 voices murmuring in disbelief as their queen, their invincible, unchanging queen, moved with hesitation for the first time in living memory. The guards watched with growing unease as she reached the steps, their hands instinctively moving toward their weapons, though they didn't know what threat they were preparing to face. At the base of the platform, she paused. The weight of 2 centuries pressed down upon her shoulders, the accumulated authority of a reign built on the certainty that mercy was weakness, that love was liability, that the only way to protect what mattered was to destroy anything that might threaten it. But Ryan's words echoed in her mind, cutting through the careful logic of survival with the devastating simplicity of truth. She raised her voice, and the crowd strained to hear words that would reshape their understanding of everything they thought they knew about their world. This man came to bring peace, she announced, her voice carrying across the silent square. I answered with death. The crowd stirred, confusion rippling through the ranks of her subjects. This was not the voice of condemnation they expected, not the cold pronouncement of justice they had come to witness. This was something else entirely, something that sounded almost like confession. She turned to face them, these millions of beings who had lived their entire lives under the shadow of her absolute rule, and spoke words that no one, least of all herself, had ever expected to hear from the lips of Queen Asher. I was wrong. The silence that followed was deeper than death itself. Even Ryan blinked in disbelief, his smile faltering for the first time since she had known him. Guards stood frozen at their posts, nobles gasped behind jeweled hands, and common citizens stared in wonder at the impossible sight of their queen admitting fallibility. But Asher was no longer thinking about her subjects or her reputation or the carefully maintained facade of infallibility that had kept her empire stable for 200 years. She was thinking about a young girl holding her sister's hand as life faded from her eyes, about the choice she had made in that moment of grief, and about the man hanging behind her who somehow saw through the armor of power to the heart she had thought buried beyond all hope of resurrection. She walked back up the platform, her movements deliberate and sure despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. With her own hands, hands that had signed death warrants and toppled governments, she began to remove the chains that bound Ryan to the ancient crucifix. The metal fell away with a sound like freedom itself being born. Ryan collapsed forward, his strength finally failing after days of imprisonment and torture, but Asher caught him. Her arms, accustomed to wielding weapons and wearing crowns, now held him with a gentleness that surprised them both. The image burned itself into the collective memory of everyone present, the alien queen and the crucified human, standing together not as ruler and subject, not as captor and prisoner, but as something new, something that defied every category their world had ever known. She looked down at him as he leaned against her, his body trembling with exhaustion, but his eyes still bright with that inexplicable light. You still smile, she whispered, wonder coloring her voice. He nodded weakly, using what little strength remained to meet her gaze. It means I still believe. And for the first time in her long, cold reign, as she held this impossible human who had somehow managed to crack the armor around her heart with nothing more than hope and faith and an unshakable belief in the possibility of redemption. Queen Asher found that she believed too. That night, as twin suns set behind the palace spires painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Xiron Empire began to change. Not through conquest or decree, not through the familiar machinery of power and control, but through something far more powerful and infinitely more fragile, the radical act of one heart choosing to remember how to love. Asher had helped Ryan down the platform steps, supporting his weight as his legs threatened to give way beneath him. Each step they took together sent ripples through the crowd, whispers of wonder and disbelief spreading like wildfire through the ranks of subjects who had never imagined their queen capable of such tenderness. By the time they reached the base of the platform, the murmur of voices had grown to a roar, not of anger or confusion, but of something that sounded remarkably like hope. "He is free," she had announced to the crowd, her voice carrying across the square with an authority that was somehow both absolute and gentle. The words landed like seeds in fertile ground, taking root in hearts that had been waiting centuries for permission to remember what compassion felt like. Now, hours later, as palace healers tended to Ryan's wounds in the royal chambers that had never before housed a prisoner, much less a human prisoner who had become something else entirely, Asher stood at her window watching her city transform. Lights flickered in windows where families gathered to discuss what they had witnessed. In the streets below, her subjects moved with a different energy, as if the very air had changed composition. "Your Majesty," her chief advisor ventured, appearing at her side with the careful movements of one approaching a wild animal. "The council is concerned. There are questions about precedent, about the implications of—" "The council will adapt," Asher interrupted softly, not turning from the window. "As will we all." Behind her, Ryan stirred from the healing sleep that had claimed him. His voice, still weak but growing stronger, cut through the advisor's protests. "She's right, you know. Change isn't something you control. It's something you allow." Asher turned to look at him, this human who had somehow managed to see past 2 centuries of carefully constructed defenses to the heart she had thought lost forever. He was sitting up now, the worst of his injuries already healing under the care of the Empire's finest physicians. But it was the look in his eyes that truly restored him. The same gentle fire that had first caught her attention, now burning, brighter than ever. The advisor retreated, muttering about protocols and procedures, leaving them alone in the vast chamber where so many momentous decisions had been made through the years. But none of those decisions had felt like this one, personal, intimate, charged with possibilities that extended far beyond the boundaries of empire or politics. "What happens now?" Ryan asked, and though his words were simple, they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions. What happens to a queen who admits she was wrong? What happens to an empire built on fear when its ruler chooses love? What happens to 2 people who have found something precious in the space between enemy and friend? Asher moved to sit beside him, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes that reminded her of sunlight on water. "Now," she said, reaching out to take his hand in hers, the first time in 2 centuries that she had touched another being without armor or ceremony or the weight of judgment between them. "We learn what it means to build something instead of breaking it." Outside the palace walls, the empire continued its quiet transformation. Citizens who had lived their entire lives in careful silence began to speak to one another of dreams and possibilities. Children who had never seen their queen show mercy began to imagine different ways of being strong. And somewhere in the space between what was and what could be, the seed of a new kind of kingdom began to take root. It would not be an easy transformation. Centuries of rule through fear could not be undone in a single night. And there would be challenges ahead that would test both their resolve and their newfound understanding of what true strength looked like. But as Asher held Ryan's hand and felt his fingers intertwine with hers, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The alien queen and the human who had taught her to smile again sat together in comfortable silence, watching through tall windows as their World learned slowly and carefully how to hope again. And in that moment they both understood that the greatest revolution was not the conquest of territory or the accumulation of power, but the simple, radical act of one heart teaching another how to love. The empire of fear was ending. The empire of hearts had begun.